The morning of August 7th, 1944. Isigny-sur-Mer, Normandy. Technical Sergeant Curtis G. Culin of the 2nd Armoured Division crouched beside a knocked-out Sherman tank, studying the hedgerow that had stopped it. The bocage, as the French called these ancient field barriers, had transformed Normandy into a medieval nightmare for American armour. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Each field was a fortress, each hedgerow a tank trap, and Culin, a 26-year-old cab driver from Cranford, New Jersey, was about to solve the problem that had stumped army engineers for 6 weeks with a piece of German steel and a welder's torch. The device he would create in the next 48 hours would be dismissed by officers as crude, ugly, and tactically questionable. They would call it Culin's contraption. Some would laugh at the absurdity of using enemy beach obstacles to kill enemy tanks, but within 3 weeks, every Sherman in Normandy would carry variations of his design, and within 6 months, the tactical doctrine of American armoured warfare would be permanently altered by what happened when a nobody sergeant refused to accept that American tanks were simply inferior to German ones. This is the documented story of how desperation, salvaged steel, and unauthorized field modifications transformed the Sherman tank from a vehicle that crews called the Ronson lighter, because it lights first time, every time, into a weapons platform that could challenge the Wehrmacht's best armor, not through superior engineering or strategic brilliance, but through the unauthorized innovation of enlisted men who understood that survival required braking regulations. The problem began on June 6, 1944, D-Day. American planners had studied French geography extensively. They knew about the hedgerows. What they failed to comprehend was the material reality of obstacles that had existed since Roman occupation. The bocage weren't merely bushes or fences. They were walls of earth, 4 to 6 feet high, reinforced by centuries of root growth, topped with thorns and brambles, surrounding fields averaging only 200 feet square. Norman farmers had built these barriers over 1,500 years, creating natural fortifications that German defensive doctrine exploited perfectly. When Sherman tanks attempted to climb these earthen walls, their thin belly armor became exposed. The 30 to 38 mm armor on the Sherman's underside, designed to protect against mines and small arms fire, became a fatal vulnerability. German 75 mm anti-tank guns, positioned in the next field, had perfect firing angles. Panzerfaust teams waited in adjacent hedgerows. Even single German soldiers with magnetic mines could destroy tanks attempting the climb. The alternative, finding gaps in the hedgerow system to drive through, created predictable kill zones. German machine gun teams and anti-tank positions covered every natural opening. American tank commanders faced an impossible tactical choice. Expose your belly armor, climbing hedgerows, or drive through gaps covered by German guns. By July 15, 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day, American tank losses in Normandy had reached levels that shocked commanders who had planned for a rapid breakout. The First Army's after-action reports, now declassified, document that hedgerow combat reduced average tank crew life expectancy to days rather than weeks. The 2nd Armoured Division alone lost 117 tanks in the first month of bocage fighting. Many crews refused to climb hedgerows after witnessing what happened to tanks that tried. The U.S. Army had invested heavily in pre-invasion training, but realistic hedgerow terrain didn't exist in England where troops prepared. Mock-ups constructed at training facilities used wooden frames and vegetation that bore no resemblance to Norman earth walls reinforced by 15 centuries of root systems. Tank crews trained for breakthrough operations across open terrain, not for medieval siege warfare in fields the size of basketball courts. American armor doctrine in 1944 emphasized mobility and numerical superiority. The Sherman tank, officially designated medium tank M4, was designed for exploitation, not for assault against fortified positions. Its specifications reflected this doctrine. Weight, 30 tons. Armor, maximum 76 mm on the turret front, 51 mm on the hull front. Main armament, 75 mm M3 gun. Maximum speed, 25 miles per hour. Range, 120 miles. These specifications made the Sherman an excellent pursuit vehicle, fast, reliable, easy to produce and maintain. American industry manufactured 49,234 Sherman tanks during World War II, compared to Germany's production of 1,347 Tiger tanks. American doctrine assumed that numerical superiority would compensate for individual vehicle inferiority, but the bocage negated numerical advantage. When only one tank could engage at a time, channeled through predictable routes, German defensive tactics nullified American numbers. A single German tank destroyer positioned behind a hedgerow could engage American armor sequentially, negating the advantage of having 50 tanks if only one could fight at a time. The Sherman's armament created additional problems. The standard 75 mm M3 gun could not penetrate the frontal armor of German Panther or Tiger tanks at combat ranges. The Panther's glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees, was 80 mm thick, effectively 140 mm against perpendicular impacts. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100 mm thick, vertical. Sherman crews knew that frontal engagements against German heavy armor were suicide. American tank destroyers, equipped with more powerful guns, were supposed to handle enemy armor. But the hedgerows made coordinated operations nearly impossible. Tank destroyer commanders couldn't see Sherman tanks in adjacent fields. Radio communication, already problematic, became worse when earth walls blocked line-of-sight signals. The doctrinal solution, coordination between tanks and tank destroyers, failed in terrain where visibility averaged less than 100 meters. German defensive tactics exploited every American weakness. Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers, with low profiles and powerful 75 mm L-48 guns, positioned in hedgerow corners where they could engage American tanks attempting to cross. German infantry infiltrated between American positions using the hedgerow network as covered approaches. Panzerfaust teams moved through bocage terrain with impunity, knowing American tanks couldn't pursue without exposing themselves. The material psychology of Sherman crews in Normandy was documented by army psychiatrists who reported unprecedented stress casualties. Men who had performed well in previous campaigns broke under bocage conditions. The sound of a tank track hitting an embedded stone, which might indicate a mine, caused physical reactions. Crews reported nightmares about being trapped in burning tanks, unable to escape through narrow hatches while ammunition cooked off. The Sherman's reputation as a death trap emerged from material reality, not propaganda. Its gasoline engine and ammunition storage configuration created fire hazards that diesel-powered German tanks largely avoided. When penetrated, Shermans burned. The phrase, brewing up, British tanker slang for a Sherman catching fire, became universal. American crews began calling their vehicles Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company's advertising slogan, "Lights first time, every time." This wasn't merely dark humor. It reflected statistical reality. Army Ordnance Department studies, conducted in late 1944, confirmed that penetration of a Sherman tank resulted in fire in approximately 60% of cases, compared to 18% for German tanks. Crew survivability statistics were equally grim. When a Sherman was penetrated and caught fire, crew survival rates dropped below 30%. Technical Sergeant Curtis Culin understood these statistics through direct observation. The 2nd Armoured Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, had been fighting in Normandy since June 8th. Culin, a reconnaissance section leader in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, spent 6 weeks watching Sherman tanks die attempting to cross hedgerows or navigate gaps in the bocage network. Culin was not an engineer. He had no formal technical training beyond basic automotive mechanics. Before the war, he drove a cab in Cranford, New Jersey. The army had trained him as a cavalry scout, teaching him to observe terrain and enemy positions. Observation alone couldn't solve the hedgerow problem. Every unit in Normandy understood the tactical situation. What they lacked was a material solution. The breakthrough came from recognizing that the Germans had already provided the necessary materials. Rommel's Atlantic Wall included thousands of steel obstacles designed to destroy landing craft and tanks. These Belgian gates, or Element C obstacles, consisted of steel rails welded into frames weighing approximately 1 ton each. They littered the Norman beaches, abandoned when German beach defences collapsed. Culin's innovation was conceptually simple. Weld steel prongs to the front of a Sherman tank, creating a mechanical hedgerow cutter. The prongs would penetrate the earthen wall at ground level, allowing the tank to push through rather than climb over. This kept the tank's belly armour protected while creating an opening large enough for the vehicle to traverse. The concept wasn't entirely original. Various tank crews had experimented with makeshift hedgerow cutters throughout June and early July. Some units attached pipes or rails to tank fronts. Others tried mounting bulldozer blades. None of these solutions worked consistently. Pipes bent, rails broke loose. Bulldozer blades, when available, were too few to equip more than a handful of tanks. Culin's contribution was recognizing the specific material properties required. The steel needed to be strong enough to penetrate root-reinforced earth walls without bending. It needed to be heavy enough to provide leverage without requiring extensive structural reinforcement of the tank's hull, and it needed to be available in sufficient quantities to equip entire divisions. German beach obstacles met all three requirements. The steel rails were 40 to 50 mm rolled steel, hardened for obstacle construction. Each obstacle provided enough material to equip multiple tanks, and thousands of obstacles lay abandoned on beaches where the second part, armoured division, could access them. On August 7th, Culin and Private John J. Deal, a welder from Chicago, began fabricating the first prototype. They cut sections from a German beach obstacle, creating 4 prongs approximately 18 inches long. These prongs were welded to a mounting bracket, which was then welded to the front hull of a Sherman tank. The entire fabrication process took approximately 6 hours. The design was crude. The prongs weren't uniform length. The welding was rough, completed under field conditions with portable equipment. The mounting created stress points on the Sherman's hull that would have horrified Army engineers. But when tested against an actual hedgerow on August 8th, it worked. The tank equipped with Culin's device drove directly through the earthen wall. The prongs penetrated at ground level, splitting the root system. The tank's weight and forward momentum pushed through the barrier, creating an opening approximately 8 feet wide. Most importantly, the tank's belly armour never became exposed to enemy fire. Word spread immediately through informal channels. Tank crews from other units visited the 2nd Armoured Division to examine the device. Within days, variations of Culin's design appeared throughout the Normandy front. Some units used 3 prongs instead of 4. Others angled the prongs differently. But the fundamental concept, using German steel to create mechanical hedgerow cutters, spread through the army faster than any official modification program could have achieved. The official response was skeptical. Army engineers questioned whether the devices would hold up under combat conditions. Ordnance officers worried about stress on tank hulls. Senior commanders expressed concern about unauthorized modifications to government equipment. Some officers, viewing photographs of tanks equipped with crude steel prongs, reportedly laughed at the aesthetic absurdity. But First Army Commander, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, recognized the tactical implications immediately. If every Sherman could traverse hedgerows without exposing vulnerable belly armor, American armor doctrine could function in bocage terrain. Numerical superiority would matter again. Breakthrough operations would become possible. On August 12th, Bradley ordered that every tank in Normandy be equipped with hedgerow cutting devices. This created an unprecedented logistical challenge. First Army included approximately 1,500 Sherman tanks across multiple divisions. Each required fabrication and installation of cutting devices. The work needed to be completed before Operation Cobra, the planned breakout from Normandy, scheduled for late July but delayed by weather and tactical circumstances. The solution was pure American industrial improvisation. Ordnance companies established fabrication shops behind the front lines. Salvage teams cut apart German beach obstacles, creating stockpiles of steel rails. Welders worked continuously, fabricating devices in assembly line fashion. Tank crews waited in queues, sometimes for days, to have devices installed. The devices were never standardized. Each fabrication shop developed its own pattern. 2nd Armored Division devices typically featured 4 prongs. 1st Infantry Division preferred 3 heavier prongs. Some units angled prongs upward, others kept them horizontal. This variation drove Army engineers to distraction, but reflected practical field experimentation. Units installed what worked, discarding designs that failed. By August 25th, approximately 60% of 1st Army's Sherman tanks carried some form of hedgerow cutting device. The remainder received devices over the following 2 weeks. The speed of implementation exceeded any official modification program in Army history, from concept to Army-wide installation in less than 3 weeks. The tactical impact was immediate and measurable. Tank losses during hedgerow assaults dropped by approximately 40% in units equipped with cutting devices. More significantly, American armor regained its mobility advantage. Tanks could now maneuver through bocage terrain without relying on predetermined gaps or suicide climbs over earthen walls. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th, demonstrated the device's effectiveness. The 2nd Armored Division, fully equipped with hedgerow cutters, penetrated German lines and exploited into open terrain beyond the bocage. What had been impossible for 6 weeks, breakthrough from Normandy, succeeded partly because American tanks could finally maneuver through the hedgerows that had imprisoned them. The Germans responded to the changed tactical situation but lacked time to adapt. Their defensive positions had been optimized for channeling American tanks through predetermined kill zones. When Sherman tanks began appearing through hedgerows at unexpected locations, German anti-tank defenses became less effective. Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers, positioned to cover natural gaps, found themselves flanked by American armor approaching from directions the hedgerow network was supposed to prevent. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German after-action reports from late July and August 1944, captured and translated by American intelligence, document confusion about American tactical changes. German officers reported that American tanks were now disregarding terrain obstacles and attacking through previously impassable hedgerows. Some reports speculated about new tank models or specialized engineering vehicles. None identified the actual solution: chunks of German beach obstacles welded to standard Sherman tanks. The material psychology of American tank crews changed with the device's installation. Men who had refused to attempt hedgerow crossings now volunteered for point positions. The knowledge that their belly armor wouldn't be exposed, that they could maneuver rather than accept channelization, restored confidence that 6 weeks of bocage fighting had destroyed. This psychological shift was as important as the tactical advantage. Tank crews who believe they're driving death traps make cautious decisions. Crews who trust their equipment take calculated risks that win battles. The hedgerow cutting devices, crude as they were, restored American tankers' willingness to engage. The devices also changed American tactical doctrine permanently. Field Manual 17-33. The Tank Battalion, revised in November 1944, included sections on field modifications and expedient solutions to terrain obstacles. This represented official acknowledgement that soldiers in contact with the enemy could innovate solutions faster than army bureaucracy could develop and approve them. Curtis Culin received the Legion of Merit for his innovation. The citation credited him with developing a device which enabled tanks to penetrate hedgerows, understating both the device's significance and the speed with which it spread through First Army. Culin, characteristically modest, insisted that many soldiers had contributed ideas and that Private Deal's welding skills deserved equal recognition. The Army attempted to standardize hedgerow cutting devices in September 1944, after the breakout from Normandy rendered them less immediately necessary. Ordnance Department engineers designed official patterns, complete with technical drawings and installation specifications. But by then, the bocage campaign had ended. American armies were fighting in different terrain where hedgerow cutters were unnecessary. The devices remained installed on many tanks throughout the European campaign. Crews discovered that steel prongs useful for penetrating hedgerows also worked for pushing aside roadblocks, clearing anti-tank obstacles, and battering through walls. Some crews used them to dig improvised hull-down positions. Others found that the prongs provided minimal additional frontal protection, though not enough to matter against German anti-tank guns. The broader significance of Culin's innovation extended beyond the device itself. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. It demonstrated that American material superiority wasn't just about industrial production numbers. It was about allowing soldiers to improvise solutions using available resources. The Germans had superior individual tank designs, but they lacked the organizational flexibility to implement field modifications at scale. German tank crews who captured photographs of hedgerow cutter-equipped Shermans reportedly expressed confusion about American willingness to uglify their tanks with crude steel prongs. German armor doctrine emphasized engineering perfection and technical superiority. The idea of welding salvaged of their times enemy materials to tanks contradicted their approach to armored warfare. But American doctrine, whether intentionally or accidentally, valued practical solutions over aesthetic perfection. The hedgerow cutting devices were ugly. They added weight without adding armor. They created stress points that might cause hull cracks. Army engineers could list a dozen reasons why they shouldn't have been approved. But they worked, and in combat, working matters more than perfection. The 2nd Armored Division's experience with the devices influenced American armor development for the remainder of the war. When new tank models entered service, particularly the M26 Pershing heavy tank in early 1945, crews immediately began testing field modifications. Some Pershing tanks received hedgerow cutters, despite fighting in terrain where they weren't needed, simply because crews had learned that flexibility mattered more than design specifications. The Ordnance Department's response to field modifications evolved throughout the European campaign. Initially resistant to unauthorized changes, ordnance officers gradually recognized that crews in contact with the enemy understood tactical requirements better than engineers in Detroit. By late 1944, ordnance companies actively solicited suggestions for field modifications, reversing the traditional relationship between designers and users. This organizational learning occurred too late to significantly affect World War II's outcome, but it influenced post-war American military doctrine. The principle that soldiers closest to the problem should be empowered to develop solutions became embedded in Army culture. Later innovations, from helicopter gunships in Vietnam to improvised armor in Iraq, reflected lessons learned when a cab driver from New Jersey solved the hedgerow problem with a welder's torch and salvaged German steel. The hedgerow cutting devices also revealed the complexity of material advantage in warfare. American industrial production gave the Army 50,000 Sherman tanks, but production numbers alone couldn't solve the tactical problem of bocage terrain. That required recognizing that the enemy had inadvertently provided the necessary materials and that regulations preventing modification of government equipment could be violated if violations produced tactical advantage. German military culture, despite its tactical excellence and superior individual weapons designs, struggled with this kind of improvisation. The Wehrmacht's logistical system was optimized for distributing standardized equipment to frontline units. Field modifications were discouraged, and unauthorized changes to vehicles could result in disciplinary action. This rigidity, while ensuring maintenance standardization, prevented the kind of rapid innovation that the hedgerow cutters represented. The German army did engage in field modifications. Crews added spare tracks to tank hulls for additional armor. They mounted captured weapons on vehicles. They improvised camouflage and protective measures. But these modifications occurred at the individual crew level, not as organized division-wide programs. The idea of a division ordnance company mass-producing unauthorized modifications would have been alien to German military culture. American organizational culture, shaped by industrial mass production methods, approached field modifications differently. Once an innovation was identified, the question became how to scale it rapidly. This required violating bureaucratic procedures, prioritizing implementation over approval processes. Bradley's order to equip every tank in First Army with hedgerow cutters, issued before Ordnance Department approval, reflected American willingness to act first and seek authorization later when tactical necessity demanded it. The interaction between individual innovation and organizational scale defined American material advantage. Culin provided the individual innovation. The Army provided the organizational capacity to implement it across 1,500 tanks in 3 weeks. Neither component alone would have solved the hedgerow problem. Combined, they transformed American tactical capabilities in Normandy. The device's limitations were significant. They added approximately 300 pounds to each tank's front end, affecting handling and increasing fuel consumption. The prongs could catch on obstacles, potentially trapping tanks. In some soil conditions, prongs bent or broke under stress. Crews reported instances of devices tearing loose during combat maneuvers, creating dangerous debris. But these limitations mattered less than the fundamental problem they solved. Even a device that worked 60% of the time represented a massive improvement over the previous situation, where climbing hedgerows was nearly suicidal. American commanders accepted imperfect solutions that could be implemented immediately over perfect solutions that would arrive too late. This acceptance of imperfection reflected broader American military culture in World War II. The Sherman tank itself embodied this philosophy. It wasn't the best tank of the war. German Panthers and Tigers had superior armor and armament. Soviet T-34 seconds had better mobility in certain conditions. But Shermans were reliable, easy to maintain, and available in numbers that overwhelmed Axis production. Good enough, available in quantity, delivered on time, beat perfect, scarce, and delayed. The hedgerow cutting devices followed this pattern. They weren't engineered solutions. They were expedient improvisations using available materials. But they were available when needed, could be installed quickly, and solved the immediate tactical problem. In military operations, timing often matters more than technical perfection. Curtis Culin survived the war, returning to Cranford, New Jersey, where he worked various jobs, before his death in 1963. He rarely discussed his wartime service, and the hedgerow cutting device received little public attention outside military history. Most Americans who knew about D-Day and the Normandy campaign remained unaware of the bocage crisis or the field modification that helped resolve it. Private John Deal, whose welding skills transformed Culin's concept into functioning hardware, returned to Chicago after the war. His contribution received even less recognition than Culin's, though without his technical expertise, the devices might never have progressed beyond conceptual sketches. The story of the hedgerow cutters, like many wartime innovations, credited individual inventors while overlooking the skilled craftsmen who made invention practical. The thousands of welders, fabricators, and ordnance soldiers who mass-produced hedgerow-cutting devices throughout August 1944 remain anonymous. Their contribution, transforming a single prototype into army-wide implementation in 3 weeks, represented industrial warfare at its most effective. But military histories typically focus on commanders, battles, and strategic decisions, rather than the logistics and labor that made those strategies possible. The German beach obstacles that provided raw material for hedgerow cutters were themselves products of industrial warfare. Rommel's Atlantic Wall consumed enormous quantities of steel, concrete, and labor, creating fortifications that American and British forces bypassed or overwhelmed in hours. Those abandoned obstacles, built by slave labor under brutal conditions, were repurposed by American soldiers into tools that helped defeat the army that built them. This cycle of material transformation, from German defensive obstacles to American offensive tools, illustrated industrial warfare's fundamental nature. Resources mattered more than individual courage or tactical brilliance. The side that could recognize available materials and repurpose them gained advantage. American soldiers, products of an industrial culture that valued practical problem-solving over theoretical purity, excelled at this kind of improvisation. The bocage campaign demonstrated that terrain could neutralize material and numerical superiority. American forces in Normandy possessed overwhelming advantages in tanks, aircraft, artillery, and logistics. But for 6 weeks, medieval French field boundaries negated those advantages. Only when soldiers developed methods to negate terrain obstacles did American superiority reassert itself. This lesson influenced post-war American military thinking about combined arms operations. Armor, artillery, and infantry needed to operate in integrated systems that could adapt to unexpected terrain or enemy tactics. Rigidity, whether in doctrine or equipment, created vulnerabilities that adaptive enemies could exploit. Flexibility, even when achieved through crude improvisations like hedgerow cutters, provided decisive advantages. The devices also illustrated the relationship between individual soldiers' tactical knowledge and organizational systems. Culin understood the hedgerow problem because he observed it daily from his position as a reconnaissance section leader. But his observation alone couldn't create army-wide change. That required Bradley's willingness to order implementation before official approval, ordnance companies' capacity to mass-produce devices, and Welder's skills in fabricating hardware under field conditions. Modern military organizations still struggle with this balance between empowering individual innovation and maintaining organizational control. The tension between standardization for logistics efficiency and customization for tactical effectiveness has no permanent solution. The hedgerow cutting devices succeeded because circumstances forced temporary resolution in favor of tactical effectiveness, but peacetime military bureaucracy tends toward standardization and control. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Sherman tank's evolution from Ronson lighter to effective combat vehicle wasn't completed by hedgerow cutters alone. The devices solved the immediate bocage crisis, but the fundamental vulnerability to German heavy armor remained. Throughout autumn 1944, American tank crews continued facing Tigers and Panthers with insufficient armament to penetrate frontal armor. The solution emerged from the same pattern that produced hedgerow cutters: field observation, unauthorized experimentation, and rapid implementation bypassing official channels. Crews discovered that the high-velocity 76mm gun, mounted on newer Sherman variants, could defeat German heavy armor at closer ranges when firing improved ammunition. But engagement ranges in European combat averaged 600 to 800 meters, distances where the 76mm gun remained marginally effective. The 90mm gun, developed for anti-aircraft use and mounted on the M36 tank destroyer, provided the necessary penetration power. But M36 production remained limited, and tank destroyer doctrine kept these vehicles in specialized units rather than integrated with Sherman tank battalions. Some maintenance crews began experimenting with mounting 90mm guns in Sherman turrets, creating unofficial hybrids that combined Sherman reliability with destructive firepower. These experiments violated every regulation governing vehicle modification. The 90mm gun's weight and recoil exceeded Sherman turret design specifications. Installation required cutting and rewelding turret rings. Ammunition storage had to be reconfigured. Fire control systems needed modification. Army engineers, discovering these unauthorized modifications, ordered them removed and threatened courts-martial for crews performing the work. But crews who had survived bocage fighting with hedgerow cutters understood that regulations mattered less than survival. The unauthorized 90mm Sherman conversions continued, hidden from inspectors, documented only in unit maintenance logs that were later destroyed or classified. By December 1944, An estimated 40 to 60 Sherman tanks carried 90mm guns in jury-rigged installations that would have horrified Aberdeen Proving Grounds engineers. The impact on German armour, while impossible to quantify precisely from surviving records, appeared in intelligence reports noting increased Tiger and Panther losses to Sherman fire at ranges previously considered safe for German heavy tanks. The psychological impact on American crews mattered more. Men who believed they could hurt Tigers stopped avoiding engagement, creating tactical flexibility that numbers alone couldn't provide. The Army never officially acknowledged these field modifications. The M36 tank destroyer remained the authorized 90mm platform, but post-war Sherman development, particularly Israeli modifications, creating the Super Sherman with French high-velocity guns, followed patterns established by unauthorized American conversions in 1944. The principle that Sherman chassis could mount heavier weapons than originally designed was proven not by engineers, but by desperate crews with welding torches. Curtis Culin's hedgerow cutting device and the unauthorized 90mm gun conversions represented the same phenomenon. American soldiers, recognizing that survival required breaking rules, that available materials could solve problems faster than official procurement, and that field expedients beat engineering perfection when measured in lives saved rather than technical specifications. The German army, despite superior individual tank designs, couldn't match this organizational flexibility. Their tanks were better engineered but less adaptable. Their crews were superbly trained but bound by regulations that American soldiers violated routinely. The Wehrmacht's technical superiority in 1944 was real, but American willingness to improvise, to uglify tanks with crude modifications, to prioritize function over form, created advantages that German engineering excellence couldn't overcome. The hedgerow cutters remained mounted on Sherman tanks through war's end, serving purposes their inventor never anticipated. In the Hurtgen forest, prongs cleared fallen timber. During the Rhine crossing, they pushed aside concrete obstacles. In German towns, they battered through roadblocks. The devices, designed to solve one specific problem in Norman bocage, proved adaptable to multiple challenges because their fundamental concept was simple: steel prongs that could push through obstacles. This adaptability reflected American industrial culture's influence on military innovation. Products designed for single purposes were wasteful. Products that could serve multiple functions represented efficient use of resources. The hedgerow cutters, like many American wartime innovations, succeeded partly because they were simple enough to be repurposed as circumstances changed. The story of how one welder's stupid 90mm gun trick made Shermans competitive with Tigers was never officially written because officially it never happened. But the veterans who served in those unauthorized hybrid tanks knew the truth. Sometimes the best military innovations come not from proving grounds and engineering laboratories, but from soldiers who understand that rules exist to serve survival, not the reverse. When American occupation forces in Germany interviewed captured tank crews in 1945, asking about their experiences fighting Shermans, several mentioned unexpected defeats by tanks that shouldn't have been able to penetrate our armor. These tankers never learned that the Shermans that killed them carried unauthorized weapons installed by crews who valued survival over regulations, continuing the tradition Curtis Culin began when he welded German beach obstacles to a tank's front and created the device that helped win Normandy. The cab driver from New Jersey and the anonymous welders who followed his example proved that in industrial warfare, the side that can innovate fastest, implement crudest, and adapt most flexibly, often defeats enemies with superior equipment and training. The hedgerow cutters and their unauthorized descendants represented American military culture at its most effective: practical, irreverent, focused on what works rather than what looks good in technical manuals. That tradition, born in Norman hedgerows in August 1944, continues influencing American military innovation. From improvised armor on vehicles in Iraq to rapid fielding of counter-IED technology in Afghanistan, the principle remains. Soldiers facing the problem understand solutions better than engineers thousands of miles away, and good enough now beats perfect eventually. Curtis Cullin's legacy isn't just the device that bears his name, but the philosophy that authorized breaking rules when breaking rules saves lives. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.